Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Mike. So I'm going to follow kind of on the same theme as other Mike, but focusing on nearshore and eastern basin fisheries. Thanks to Jess and Mike from New York DEC for their contributions to the talk today. So I kind of just wanted to start with a broad scale look at the nearshore fisheries we have in Lake Ontario. You can see this is really a multi-use with different resource users. Most folks will be familiar with recreational fisheries. You can see, as Mike alluded to also, we have some highly urbanized areas in Lake Ontario where we're working to create and promote angling opportunities there. Maybe less familiar to some folks, but we do have commercial fisheries as well down at the eastern end of the lake and Indigenous fisheries. The St. Lawrence River is kind of indicated on here. I'm not going to focus on that. Mike Ewell will be talking about everything St. Lawrence in another talk, so stay tuned for that. I think Mike Connerton and I started to try to add species to this, and it quickly became super visually overwhelming and not very informative. I left it on here because I think it just highlights that there is really a lot of diversity in species that are targeted, and some of that's very area specific. So I'll get into this a little bit more throughout the talk. I think often when we think of Lake Ontario fisheries, we think of recreational trout and salmon. It's a highly valued, highly targeted fishery, but warm water fisheries are also really valued and targeted in Lake Ontario. New York's 2019 statewide survey showed that 50% of days fished on the lake were for warm water species, with a value of over 280 million US dollars. In addition to that, a lot of species on Lake Ontario, these nearshore species get really big, and so they support, many of them, trophy fisheries. You can see some cool state records there in those photos from Lake Ontario. So before I get into some of the specific fisheries, I just wanted to highlight that New York and Ontario manage fisheries through assessment and monitoring. And so many agencies conduct fish population and community assessments. And you can see some of the different gear that we use here, our netting programs to inform stock status, so helping us understand things like relative abundance through time. Then we also have angler surveys where we're understanding fishing effort, catch and harvest trends. So folks are out there talking to anglers on the water at access points. And so altogether, this helps inform management decisions and maintain sustainable fisheries. So I'm kind of going to highlight some of the nearshore fisheries now, starting at the west end of the lake in Ontario. You heard a little bit about this from Mike already, but we have some really highly urbanized areas in Ontario, around Lake Ontario, and population growth is predicted to be high in the future. Not only are these really urbanized areas around the GTA, but Toronto and Hamilton Harbour are designated areas of concern under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So that means they're more degraded than other Great Lakes areas. So there's lots of agencies and partners working to restore these areas. That includes M&R. But there's also this opportunity to create and promote urban fisheries and really to attract new anglers that maybe don't have traditional access to the resource and connect them to the Great Lakes. One of the ways M&R is doing this is through stocking. And so we have been stocking in the nearshore area walleye into Hamilton and Toronto Harbour. This is an effort to restore a native top predator to the fish community. Historically, walleye were naturally occurring in these areas and then became kind of extirpated through the urbanization and degradation. So we're looking to reintroduce walleye, but also hoping, for potential urban fishing opportunities. So Hamilton stocking began kind of around 2012, and you can see on the graph there in the blue line, that's our catches of walleye from our trap netting assessment program. And so catches have been increasing through time. So we've seen that stocking's been really successful, where those fish are growing and maturing in Hamilton really well. Department of Fisheries and Oceans is also active in this area. They've seen increased catches in their electrofishing program, and they're doing some additional research around assessing natural reproduction. What's also really exciting is that we saw a new fishery emerge in the area. So there was articles coming out about sport fishing returning to the harbor, people targeting walleye, people catching walleye. So it's just a pretty cool example. If you've seen or been to Hamilton, it's a highly urban, highly industrial area. So the fact that we can have these fishing opportunities in the area is pretty exciting. So as I mentioned, we also stock walleye into Toronto Harbor. That kind of amped up a little bit more recently around 2019. We haven't seen as high catches in the area from our trap net program, but we do see anglers catching some walleye. We also stock brown trout in the Nearshore in Toronto as well. I kind of wanted to highlight here that we had recently had some major investments in the Toronto area around habitat improvements. You may or may not have heard this, I think, last year, but a project around the Don River mouth naturalization. You can see the photo of pre and kind of post there. A lot of this was around flood control, but also creating habitat, including aquatic habitat for fish. I think what's really exciting is that they have incorporated what are called recreational nodes, essentially encouraging folks and their ability to interact with the water and the resource, and that will include urban fishing nodes. So M&R and partners were actively promoting angling in the Toronto area, and there's a couple programs that I'll highlight that are doing some great work. So the Toronto Urban Fishing Ambassadors are a group that promote recreational fishing in the area through angling education, stewardship, conservation, and really advocating for access. This group sits on our Fisheries Management Zone 20 Council. You can see some of these pictures. It's just pretty incredible, like right in downtown Toronto with the CN Tower in the background, folks catching some pretty cool fish, diversity of species. So really exciting. In addition, M&R has a Learn to Fish program. This is designed to teach new anglers how to fish. This is across the province, but there is actually a permanent location in downtown Toronto at Tommy Thompson Park in partnership with Toronto Region Conservation Authority. So they have public sessions as well as camp groups targeting youth. There's a lot of demand for them in this area. And you can see in the map, there's actually other permanent locations in the broader GTA. So a lot of, again, effort to create and promote these urban fisheries. So with that, I'm going to switch gears and move on to the east end of the lake and start in the Bay of Quinte. So this is a Z-shaped embayment in Ontario. It's a really productive area. It supports diverse fish communities and, as a result, diverse fisheries. I think the area is really unique in that it's multi-use. So we have recreational, commercial, and Indigenous fisheries that are all really active in the area. The recreational fishery, we see a lot of effort in the summer, over 140,000 angler hours annually. Most folks are targeting walleye. From our angler surveys, we see it's about 84%, but also effort towards largemouth, northern pike, and yellow perch. The winter fishery is also really popular, 160,000 plus angler hours. Again, most folks targeting walleye, but also yellow perch. There's a pretty cool lake trout fishery in the lower bay. I know that's not a nearshore species, but it is close to shore in this area, so I'm going to count it and I'll talk about that a little bit more. But the commercial fishery, it is a small scale fishery, but locally it holds a lot of importance. Many of these folks are fourth, fifth generational fishers, so there's a lot of kind of traditional cultural importance there. The fishery is regulated through quotas and year and seasonal restrictions. We see the most harvested species in the bay are generally sunfish and yellow perch, with some other species in there as well. So I'm going to highlight walleye in the bay because it is an important species across all three of these fisheries. And I'll start with a little bit of ecology. So the Bay of Quinte population's pretty cool and unique in their spatial distribution and migrations seasonally. So this is some work done in partnership with Queen's University and Dr. Tufts Lab. Folks have likely seen it before, but this used acoustic telemetry to track fish that were tagged in the Bay of Quinte. And so really these fish are spawning in May in the upper bay, and they quickly move out into the eastern basin in the summer, and they're out here feeding on alewife. Some of them make large scale movements into the river and down to the west end of the lake. This was when the receiver coverage wasn't fully covered on the lake, so those fish probably didn't move directly across Lake Ontario, but you can see in the winter they move back into the bay, and they actually overwinter in the bay before spawning the following April. So I highlight this because it's really neat to see that the fisheries themselves really kind of mimic this movement or spatial use of the population. So in the recreational fishery, in the summer in the Bay of Quinte, we know those adults have moved out into the eastern basin, and so the juveniles are really what are occupying the bay. And so in that fishery, folks are targeting those younger fish. We see really high catch rates. The winter fishery, when those adults move back into the bay and they're overwintering, it really turns into more of a trophy fishery, and folks are looking to target those big walleye. Commercially, from the commercial side, in the bay, walleye are only harvested in the lower portion of the Bay of Quinte, and that's restricted by gear sizes and quota. The graph just highlights the harvest across different fisheries. So we see most harvest in the open water recreational fishery at about 65%, the ice fishery sitting at about 10%, and then the commercial at 25%. So before I move on from the bay, I just wanted to highlight a kind of unique 2026 fishery that emerged in the lower bay. As folks probably know, ice conditions were pretty phenomenal in 2026. It was a cold winter, and we saw anglers really take advantage. So in most years, there is a lake trout fishery that exists at the lower portion of the bay, right where it meets the eastern basin of Lake Ontario. In the winter, opportunities are a little bit limited because the ice doesn't form super well in most years in this area, but 2026 it did, and we saw that it attracted a huge amount of anglers looking to catch really big lake trout. So we had an aerial survey that was going on at this time in the bay, and so those folks were counting huts and anglers on the ice from the plane. Up to 112 huts and anglers counted in one day, and this is in like a 25 square kilometer area. So it was pretty exciting, and I think it just highlights how dynamic the fishery can be on the Bay of Quinte, depending on what opportunities there are. So pretty cool. I'm going to shift gears and move out into the Eastern Basin. We have both Ontario and New York waters in this area, and also both recreational and commercial fisheries. So we do see it's a multi-species fishery out there. A lot of trophy fish, large fish, so things like walleye and smallmouth bass, as well as some lake trout in the summer. And then in the more nearshore areas, folks targeting things like yellow perch and northern pike. From the commercial side, in New York waters, they're similar, like I mentioned with the bay, smaller scale fisheries, predominantly yellow perch, whereas in Ontario, it's really dominated by lake whitefish harvest. We do see a lot of seasonal differences in what species are targeted. This is some data from New York's angler surveys. You can see the proportion of boats and what folks are targeting. So in the ice fishing season, it's really dominated by walleye and yellow perch. In the open water, it shifts to bass about 50%, but other species like trout and salmon, walleye, yellow perch, pike in there as well. So I'm going to hone in on a couple species, talk about them a little bit more, starting with walleye. So in the Eastern Basin, we really have a renowned trophy fishery. We have some pretty big walleye out there. We know that, or we believe that the fishery is supported by multiple spawning stocks. So you saw the Bay of Quinte, and we know that adults are using that area in the summer. But there's also spawning stocks in New York and the St. Lawrence River as well. And so we presume that at least some of those stocks are utilizing the Eastern Basin, but the contribution is a little bit unknown. Jess in one of the next talks is going to talk a little bit more about walleye, so I'll leave this to her to elaborate on a little bit. But again, we see seasonal changes in the walleye fishery out in the Eastern Basin. New York sees the highest effort for walleye in the ice season, so that's that top graph, as well as in May around opener. But they actually see the highest catch rates in fall from August through November. At other times of the year, catch rates are a little bit lower, and so they're looking into options for improving that. In Ontario, our surveys and angler diaries indicate the most effort in the late fall, October into November, with catch rates being generally good. I will just quickly highlight our population trend for walleye. So this is our gill netting assessment program. New York and Ontario both do a version of this program in the summer. You can see the gray line in Ontario, we've had an increasing trend over the past several years. New York has been generally stable in their trend. I'll quickly highlight yellow perch. As mentioned, there is commercial fishing for yellow perch. These are small fisheries, but locally important, about 22,000 pounds harvested a year, with a little bit more of that coming from New York. New York does have a popular recreational fishery. They have a no limit harvest regulations. So folks are really attracted by that. High catch and harvest in the spring and fall with about 108,000 fish or 62,000 pounds harvested annually. Again, highlighting the population trend for perch. New York, the black line, we see a lot of variability in the catch in the assessment gill nets, but generally stable through time. In Ontario, we had declines in the late 2000s, but over the past decade, low and stable catches. So the last species I'll highlight is bass. So Lake Ontario is a top-ranked smallmouth bass destination. We have some really big fish. You can see this graph here highlighting from New York's assessment gill nets the number of over 4 pound smallmouth through time, and that's been increasing, largely attributed to incorporation of round goby in the diet. But fishing is really widespread for bass from the Bay of Quinte into the Eastern Basin and down the St. Lawrence River. Tournaments are really prominent. Mike Ewell is going to talk a little bit more about that in the St. Lawrence River talk. But in the Eastern Basin in New York, they find about up to 27% of anglers participating in bass tournaments in their angler surveys. So in Ontario, we did have a regulation change around bass recently to protect spawning fish. So research was brought forward by Dr. Bruce Tufts at Queen's University to our FMZ 20 East Council that found really the season, when the season opened, largemouth bass were generally done spawning, but smallmouth bass were still spawning at that time. So in 2021, we changed the season to delay the smallmouth opening by about 2 weeks. But we also introduced a new early pre-spawn catch and release season from January through about May 10th. And so through our surveys and angler feedback, we've seen a good uptake of that new fishery. In 2024, in our summer survey, about 22% of folks who were fishing in the summer had used fish the early season that year. We're continuing to assess this regulation change through some angler surveys, and then Queen's is continuing their research. So with that, I hope folks have seen that we have some pretty diverse and valuable nearshore and eastern basin fisheries. They're multi-use, recreational, commercial, and indigenous, providing economic and cultural value. And they're also multi-species, and some areas are really specific in what's targeted, and that changes seasonally. We have a lot of trophy fisheries and destination fisheries on the lake. In Ontario, we're looking to create and promote urban angling opportunities, attracting new anglers to the resource and connecting them to the Great Lakes. And I'll just end with that saying that Ontario and New York really actively and adaptively assess fish populations and fisheries to continue to manage for sustainable resource use and future opportunities. And that's all I got. Thanks.